He collapsed, then got back up. That was the moment Corporal Frederick George Topham defined everything about March 24th, 1945, on a German battlefield east of the Rhine River. He had been shot through the nose while treating a wounded man in the open. Blood was pouring from the wound. The pain was excruciating, and 2 medical orderlies had already been killed trying to reach the same casualty. Topham had every reason to seek medical treatment, every justification to step back and let someone else take over. But Frederick Topham did not step back from wounded men. He finished treating the casualty, carried him through continuous fire to safety, then refused evacuation. This is the story of relentless compassion under impossible conditions. The story of a stretcher-bearer who continued rescuing wounded men for 6 hours after being seriously wounded himself. The story of a medical orderly who walked into a burning vehicle to save 3 trapped soldiers. And the story of why Frederick George Topham became the only member of the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion ever awarded the Victoria Cross. March 24th, 1945, 10 o'clock in the morning, Drop Zone A, east of the Rhine River, Germany. Corporal Frederick George Topham landed hard on German soil after parachuting from a C-47 Dakota transport aircraft. The landing zone was under intense German fire, machine guns and anti-aircraft weapons raking the sky. Topham could hear the crack of bullets passing overhead and the crump of mortar shells exploding across the drop zone. All around him, Canadian paratroopers from the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion were landing under fire. Some were hit before they even touched the ground, their parachutes collapsing as they fell. Topham gathered his medical kit and began moving toward the assembly area. As a medical orderly, his job was to treat casualties, to save lives while others took them. Within minutes, Topham was already treating wounded paratroopers who had been hit during the drop. This was Operation Varsity, the largest single-day airborne operation in military history. More than 16,000 paratroopers from the British 6th Airborne Division and American 17th Airborne Division were dropping onto German-held territory. The mission was to support Operation Plunder, the Allied crossing of the Rhine River. British and Canadian ground forces had begun crossing the Rhine the previous night. The airborne divisions would land behind German lines to capture key bridges, secure high ground, and prevent German reinforcements from counterattacking. If successful, Operation Varsity would break the last major German defensive line and open the road to Berlin. But success would come at a terrible cost. Frederick George Topham had been born in York Township, Toronto, Canada, on August 10th, 1917. He grew up at 631 Beresford Avenue in Toronto's West End. His father was Harry A. Topham, and Frederick had 2 sisters, Lenore and Marion, as well as a brother, Robert J. Topham. Frederick attended King George Public School for his elementary education. He then went to Runnymede High School, which is now known as Runnymede Collegiate Institute. After finishing school, Frederick worked various jobs trying to find his place in the world. He worked as a hard rock miner in Kirkland Lake, Ontario, doing dangerous work deep underground. He worked as a rubber worker at the Goodyear plant in Toronto. He also worked at a saw company learning the lumber trade. Frederick was strong and athletic, the kind of young man who could handle physically demanding work. Friends and family called him Fred or Toppy, and he was known for being quiet and dependable. When World War II broke out in September 1939, Fred was 22 years old. Canada declared war on Germany on September 10th, 1939. Fred enlisted in the Canadian Army, joining the 48th Highlanders of Canada. But his time with the 48th was very brief, lasting only 30 days. Fred transferred to the Army Service Corps and volunteered to serve as a medical orderly. Medical orderlies were trained to provide first aid on the battlefield, to stop bleeding, treat wounds, and evacuate casualties. It was dangerous work that required courage, compassion, and the ability to function under fire. Fred was exactly the type of person the medical corps needed, strong enough to carry wounded men and calm enough to work under pressure. In 1942, Fred heard about a new unit being formed, the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion. This would be Canada's first airborne unit, trained to jump from aircraft behind enemy lines. The battalion was looking for volunteers who were physically fit, mentally tough, and willing to take extraordinary risks. Fred volunteered immediately. In 1943, Fred was sent to Fort Benning, Georgia, for parachute training. Fort Benning was the home of the United States Army Airborne School. Fred completed the grueling training course on March 12, 1943, earning his parachute wings. The training had been brutal. Countless hours of physical conditioning, tower jumps, and finally live jumps from aircraft. But Fred had proven he could handle the demands of airborne service. On July 24, 1943, Fred embarked for the United Kingdom. He was officially taken on strength with the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion. The battalion was assigned to the 3rd Parachute Brigade of the British 6th Airborne Division. This meant Canadian paratroopers would fight as part of a British division, though they maintained their Canadian identity. The 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion spent the next year training intensively in England. They practiced night jumps, weapons drills, and demolitions. They conducted exercises simulating combat drops behind enemy lines. The battalion was being prepared for the invasion of Europe, though the exact date and location were kept secret. On June 6, 1944, that date finally came. In the early hours of D-Day, Fred Topham parachuted into Normandy, France as part of Operation Tonga. The 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion dropped near the village of Varaville. Their mission was to destroy bridges and secure key positions to protect the invasion's eastern flank. The drop was chaotic. Paratroopers scattered across the dark countryside. German forces were on full alert and engaged the Canadians immediately. Fred spent the night treating wounded paratroopers under fire. The battalion accomplished its mission, but suffered heavy casualties. For the next 3 months, the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion fought in Normandy. Airborne troops were trained for quick strikes, not sustained combat. But the battalion was used as regular infantry, defending positions and conducting offensive operations. Casualties mounted steadily as the Canadians fought through bocage country and fortified villages. Fred continued his work as a medical orderly, treating wounded men in aid posts and under fire. By September 1944, the battalion had suffered over 450 casualties. The 6th Airborne Division was withdrawn to England to rest and refit. New replacements arrived to fill the gaps left by the dead and wounded. The division spent the fall training for future operations. In December 1944, the Germans launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest. The attack became known as the Battle of the Bulge. The 6th Airborne Division was rushed to Belgium to help contain the German breakthrough. The division played a relatively minor role in the battle, helping to hold defensive positions. By late January 1945, the German offensive had been defeated. The Allied armies were now poised to cross the Rhine River and invade Germany itself. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was planning Operation Plunder, a massive crossing of the Rhine in the north. Montgomery commanded 17 infantry divisions, 8 armored divisions, and 2 airborne divisions. The British 6th Airborne Division and American 17th Airborne Division would conduct the largest airborne assault in history. The airborne phase was designated Operation Varsity. Planning for Varsity began in early 1945. The lessons of previous airborne operations, especially Market Garden, had been carefully studied. At Arnhem, the British 1st Airborne Division had been dropped too far from their objectives. They had also been dropped over multiple days, allowing the Germans time to react. Varsity would be different. All paratroopers would drop at the same time in broad daylight. They would land directly on or near their objectives, not miles away. And they would drop after the ground forces had already begun crossing, not before. The 6th Airborne Division's objectives included the village of Hammenkeln, portions of Deersfort Forest, and 3 bridges over the Yssel River. The 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion was assigned to Drop Zone A, just north of Deersfort Forest. Intelligence reports indicated the area was heavily defended by German paratroopers. The battalion's commanding officer was Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Nicklin, a respected and experienced leader. On the morning of March 24, 1945, over 1,600 aircraft took off from bases in England and France. The armada included C-47 Dakotas, C-46 Commandos, and gliders of various types. The Sky Train stretched over 200 miles and took 2 hours and 37 minutes to pass any given point. Fred Topham sat in his C-47 with his fellow paratroopers from the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion. He carried his medical kit with morphine, bandages, and other supplies. The aircraft flew over Brussels, Belgium, then turned northeast toward Germany. As they approached the Rhine, German anti-aircraft fire began. Black clouds of flak burst around the aircraft, shrapnel tearing through fuselages. Some transport planes were hit and went down in flames. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the green light flashed and paratroopers began jumping. Fred Topham jumped from his aircraft into a sky filled with parachutes and anti-aircraft fire. Thousands of paratroopers were descending simultaneously toward the German-held drop zones. German gunners on the ground opened fire with everything they had. Machine guns, rifles, and anti-aircraft weapons poured fire into the descending paratroopers. Men were hit in the air, their parachutes collapsing as they fell to their deaths. Fred landed hard on the drop zone and immediately came under fire. All around him, Canadian paratroopers were gathering their equipment and moving toward the assembly areas. But many would never reach those assembly areas. Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Nicklin, the battalion commander, was killed during the drop. His parachute had caught in a tree, leaving him suspended and exposed to German fire. Nicklin was shot and killed while hanging helpless in his harness. The loss of their commanding officer was a devastating blow to the battalion. But there was no time to mourn. The battle was just beginning. Fred Topham began treating casualties almost immediately after landing. Wounded paratroopers were scattered across the drop zone, some hit during the descent, others wounded after landing. Fred moved from man to man, applying bandages, injecting morphine, stopping bleeding. German fire continued to sweep the drop zone, but Fred kept working. At around 11 o'clock in the morning, Fred heard a cry for help. A wounded paratrooper was lying in the open, completely exposed to German fire. The man was badly wounded and could not move on his own. 2 medical orderlies from a field ambulance unit went out to help the wounded man. The first orderly reached the casualty and knelt beside him to provide treatment. German machine gunners saw the medic and opened fire. The medical orderly was killed instantly, shot down while trying to save a wounded man. A second medical orderly immediately went forward to replace the man who had been killed. He reached the wounded paratrooper and knelt beside him. The German gunners fired again, and the second medic was killed in the same spot as the first. 2 medical orderlies had been killed in succession trying to reach a single casualty. Everyone watching knew that going out to that wounded man was certain death. Fred Topham watched the second medic fall. He saw the wounded paratrooper still lying exposed, still crying for help. He knew the German gunners were waiting for another target. And without hesitation, Fred stood up and walked toward the wounded man. Soldiers watching from cover shouted at Fred to get down, to stay back. But Fred kept walking across the fire-swept ground. He reached the wounded paratrooper and knelt beside him, exactly where 2 medics had already been killed. Fred began treating the casualty, applying bandages and preparing to move him. Then the German machine gunners opened fire. A bullet struck Fred Topham in the face, hitting him in the nose. The wound was severe, blood pouring from Fred's face. The pain must have been excruciating, the shock overwhelming. Any normal person would have collapsed, would have sought immediate medical treatment. But Fred Topham did not collapse. Despite the severe bleeding and intense pain, Fred never faltered in his task. He finished applying first aid to the wounded paratrooper. Then, bleeding heavily from his own wound, Fred lifted the casualty onto his shoulders. He stood up and began walking back across the open ground toward the shelter of a nearby wood. German fire continued the entire time, bullets kicking up dirt around Fred's feet. Fred walked steadily and slowly, carrying the wounded man through continuous fire. He reached the wood and delivered the casualty to safety. Other medics immediately moved to treat Fred's facial wound. But Fred refused treatment. He insisted that all other casualties be evacuated first before he received any medical attention. For the next 2 hours, Fred continued treating wounded paratroopers. Blood was still flowing from his nose wound, and the pain continued. But Fred moved from casualty to casualty, applying bandages, injecting morphine, arranging evacuations. Finally, when all the casualties had been cleared, Fred consented to have his wound dressed. A medical officer bandaged Fred's nose and told him he needed to be evacuated. The wound was serious and required proper medical treatment, but Fred refused evacuation. The medical officer ordered Fred to go to the rear for treatment, but Fred pleaded to be allowed to stay with his battalion. After considerable argument, the medical officer finally relented. Fred Topham would stay on the battlefield. Later that afternoon, the fighting intensified as German forces counterattacked. The 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion was engaging German paratroopers in vicious close-quarter fighting. Casualties mounted on both sides. The Universal Carrier, a small tracked vehicle used to transport troops and supplies, was hit by enemy fire. The carrier caught fire, flames spreading rapidly across the vehicle. Inside the burning carrier were 3 Canadian soldiers trapped by the flames. Worse, the carrier's own ammunition was beginning to explode as the fire reached it. Small arms rounds were cooking off inside the vehicle, bullets flying in all directions. Anyone approaching the carrier risked being hit by exploding ammunition. Soldiers watching from cover knew the 3 men inside would die if no one helped them. But approaching that burning, exploding carrier seemed like suicide. Fred Topham saw the burning carrier and the trapped men. He was still bleeding from his nose wound, still in pain. But without hesitation, Fred ran toward the burning vehicle. He approached the carrier despite the flames and exploding ammunition. Fred reached into the burning vehicle and pulled out the first trapped soldier. He carried the man away from the carrier to safety. Then Fred went back for the second man. The fire was getting worse, the ammunition continuing to explode. But Fred pulled the second soldier from the carrier and brought him to safety. Then Fred went back a third time. He pulled the last trapped soldier from the burning vehicle. All 3 men were alive because Fred Topham had walked into that inferno to save them. Unfortunately, one of the 3 men died shortly after being rescued. His injuries were too severe, and he passed away despite Fred's efforts. But the other 2 soldiers survived and were evacuated. Those 2 men undoubtedly owed their lives to Fred Topham. For 6 hours on March 24, 1945, Fred Topham performed a series of outstanding acts of bravery. He had walked into fire to save a wounded man after 2 other medics were killed. He had continued treating casualties for hours after being shot through the nose. He had refused medical evacuation so he could stay with his battalion. And he had walked into a burning, exploding vehicle to rescue 3 trapped soldiers. Most of that time, Fred had been in great pain from his facial wound. But he never stopped, never faltered, never put his own welfare above the wounded men who needed him. Soldiers who witnessed Fred's actions that day were amazed by his courage. His magnificent and selfless courage inspired everyone who saw it. Operation Varsity was successful, achieving all its major objectives. By the end of the day, the airborne divisions had captured their assigned villages, bridges, and wooded areas. British ground forces advancing from the Rhine bridgehead linked up with the airborne troops. The road into Germany was now open, but the cost had been terrible. The British 6th Airborne Division suffered 590 killed and another 710 wounded or missing. The American 17th Airborne Division had 430 killed, with 834 wounded and 81 missing. Over 1,100 Allied soldiers had been killed in a single day. Operation Varsity was the worst single day for Allied airborne troops in the entire war. The 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion suffered heavy casualties as well. They had lost their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Nicklin, during the drop. Dozens of Canadian paratroopers had been killed or wounded. But the battalion had accomplished its mission and held its objectives. After Varsity, the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion continued fighting as ground infantry. They advanced deeper into Germany as part of the final Allied offensive. Fred Topham continued serving as a medical orderly with the battalion. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. On August 3, 1945, the London Gazette published an extraordinary citation. The King had been graciously pleased to approve the award of the Victoria Cross to Corporal Frederick George Topham. The citation described Fred's actions on March 24th in detail. It told how 2 medical orderlies had been killed in succession trying to reach a wounded man. It described how Fred had gone forward without hesitation to replace the orderlies who had been killed before his eyes. It recounted how Fred had been shot through the nose while working on the wounded man. It detailed how Fred had carried the casualty back through continuous fire, despite severe bleeding and intense pain. It noted how Fred had refused treatment and evacuation, insisting on staying with his battalion, and it described Fred's rescue of 3 men from the burning carrier. The citation concluded, "This non-commissioned officer showed sustained gallantry of the highest order. For 6 hours, most of the time in great pain, he performed a series of acts of outstanding bravery, and his magnificent and selfless courage inspired all those who witnessed it." Fred Topham was the only member of the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion to receive the Victoria Cross. He was also the only member of the entire 6th Airborne Division to receive the Victoria Cross during Operation Varsity. The Victoria Cross was sent to Fred by registered post in 1946. He received his medal through the mail, a surprisingly low-key delivery for Britain's highest award for valor. On November 10, 1945, Fred participated in a special ceremony in Toronto. He laid the cornerstone for the new Sunnybrook Memorial Hospital for Veterans. It was a fitting honor for a medical orderly who had saved so many lives. After the war, Fred tried to return to normal civilian life. He briefly served as a constable with the Toronto Police Department. But police work did not suit Fred, and he left the force after a short time. Fred then found work with Toronto Hydro, the city's electrical utility company. He became an emergency troubleman, a first responder to electrical system problems. It was dangerous work that required quick thinking and courage, similar in some ways to his wartime service. Fred married a woman named Mary, and they settled in Etobicoke, a suburb of Toronto. They lived on Templar Drive, living a quiet life away from public attention. Fred took little part in military affairs after the war. He was not interested in publicity or attention. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiences or his Victoria Cross. Fred Topham was a modest man who simply wanted to live a normal life. On May 31, 1974, Fred Topham died suddenly at his home in Etobicoke. He was 56 years old. Fred's widow, Mary, decided on a private funeral service. As a Victoria Cross recipient, Fred was entitled to a full military funeral with honors. But Mary chose a quiet, private ceremony instead. Fred was buried at Sanctuary Park Cemetery in Etobicoke. For over 30 years, Fred's grave bore only a simple marker. On March 25, 2007, members of the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion Association gathered at the cemetery. They placed a plaque at Fred's grave recounting his Victoria Cross gallantry. The plaque ensures that visitors to the cemetery will know that a hero rests there. After Fred's death, his medals were loaned to the Canadian War Museum. But unfortunately, the medals were mostly kept in storage and not displayed to the public. When Mary Topham discovered the medals were not on display, she changed her mind about leaving them to the museum. Mary left instructions in her will that Fred's Victoria Cross and campaign medals be sold for her beneficiaries. After Mary's death, the executors of her estate contacted various military museums in Canada. They asked if the museums would be interested in purchasing Fred's medals, but none of the museums had sufficient funds to purchase the Victoria Cross. Finally, the executors approached the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion Association. A small committee was formed consisting of members of the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada and the Parachute Battalion Association. The committee negotiated with the executors to purchase the medals for $275,000. A fundraising campaign began, promoted by newspapers and television producers. Canadians donated generously to keep Fred Topham's Victoria Cross in Canada. The campaign successfully raised the necessary funds. Fred's Victoria Cross and medals are now held by the Canadian Airborne Forces Museum. So what can we learn from Fred Topham's story? What does his life tell us about courage, compassion, and duty? First, Fred's story shows that heroism is not the absence of fear, but action despite fear. Fred watched 2 medical orderlies get killed trying to reach a wounded man. He knew with absolute certainty that going out to that casualty would expose him to the same fire. But Fred went anyway because a wounded soldier needed help. That is the essence of courage, doing what must be done regardless of the cost. Second, Fred's story illustrates the power of perseverance through pain. Being shot through the nose is an agonizing injury. The pain and bleeding would have incapacitated most people, but Fred did not let his wound stop him from continuing his work. He treated casualties for hours while in great pain, refusing medical attention until all other wounded men were evacuated. That kind of endurance requires extraordinary willpower and dedication. Third, Fred's story demonstrates that medical personnel can show courage equal to any combat soldier. Fred carried no rifle, threw no grenades, killed no enemy soldiers. But his courage was no less real than that of the paratroopers fighting around him. Walking unarmed into fire to save wounded men requires a special kind of bravery. Fred's Victoria Cross recognizes that medics and stretcher bearers deserve the same recognition as combat soldiers. Fourth, Fred's story shows the importance of selflessness in the face of suffering. After being wounded, Fred could have legitimately sought medical evacuation. No one would have blamed him for leaving the battlefield. But Fred knew his battalion still needed medical orderlies. He put the needs of his comrades above his own welfare and stayed on the battlefield. That selfless dedication saved lives that day. Fifth, Fred's story reveals the character of those who seek no recognition. After the war, Fred lived quietly in Etobicoke, working for Toronto Hydro. He rarely spoke about his Victoria Cross or his wartime service. When he died, his widow chose a private funeral rather than military honors. Fred Topham was a genuine hero who wanted nothing more than to be a normal person. Finally, Fred's story reminds us that some of history's greatest acts of courage happen in the final months of war. Operation Varsity took place just 6 weeks before Germany surrendered. Everyone knew the war was ending, which made death or injury feel even more tragic. But Fred and his fellow paratroopers did their duty regardless. They crossed the Rhine, captured their objectives, and paid the price in blood. That morning on the German drop zone, Corporal Frederick George Topham faced a choice. 2 medical orderlies had been killed trying to reach a wounded man. Going out to that casualty meant walking into concentrated German fire. But Fred did not hesitate. He walked across fire-swept ground to reach the wounded paratrooper. He was shot through the nose while treating the casualty. He collapsed, then got back up. Fred finished treating the wounded man, then carried him to safety through continuous fire. He refused medical treatment and continued rescuing casualties for 6 more hours. He walked into a burning vehicle to save 3 trapped soldiers. And when the battle was over, Fred Topham had saved countless lives through his courage. Corporal Frederick George Topham, Victoria Cross, was 56 years old when he died. He was a working-class kid from Toronto who became a hard rock miner and rubber worker. He was a paratrooper who jumped into Normandy and crossed the Rhine. He was a medical orderly who walked into fire to save wounded men. And he was the only member of the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion ever awarded the Victoria Cross. That is the legacy of Corporal Frederick George Topham, VC.